Welcome to the Onstage podcast, where we interview musicians and members of the entertainment community.
The impossible is possible.
Welcome, everyone, to another podcast. We have a very special guest. So happy that he was able to join us in the podcast. His name is Alvin Law. Alvin, I don't know if there's anything different about him. He looks like everyone we all know. But let him talk about himself. But in the meantime, this guy rocks. I've seen him play the drums. He can play almost anything that everyone of you out there, including myself, consider normal, because he's normal himself. He just does things differently. So welcome, Alvin, to the podcast. How
Thank
are
you,
you
Chris.
today,
Nice
sir?
to be here. It's a pleasure. And by the way, I find this interesting that the camera is a little bit different than normal. So it actually is revealing a little bit more of what people notice than normal. When I'm in a just headshot or with the shoulders, you can't see that I don't have any arms. So very interesting the way this whole angle of the camera worked, because whether I like it or not, that is the so-called elephant in the room. And it has been my entire life. But as you've already said, when they came out during COVID with this expression, the new normal, I was going, okay, wait, what if there is no normal, period? It's just a thought, not too philosophical. But I was born this way, and I've been functioning using my feet. I actually play the piano. I do know, however, several musicians that play guitar with their feet. And man, you know what? I'm still working on the motivation to get one of those for myself. But I'm too busy to worry about having a time for hobbies. So.
Well, that's no problem, Alvin. Yeah, I've actually myself seen several artists without arms play the guitar with the feet. And people say, "How are you, Chris?" Say, "I'm good." Because when you see people that either don't have arms, like even someone like Nick Vujicic, for instance, we're familiar with him, born without arms and legs. Like it doesn't matter. You're a normal person. Don't want people to look at you and say, "Hey, make fun of you." And Alvin, can you give us a little bit, tell us about a little bit of a history of where you started and everything that happened and what your life was like?
So there's a generational gap. Young people today, I would say anybody, maybe even anyone under the age of 50 would not know much about this. But if you go the other direction, there was a stigma attached to a morning sickness medication that was doing the circuit around the world in 1959, probably as early as 1958 in Germany. It then went on to France, it went on to England, it went on to Europe, then Australia, then it got to Canada. And it was in an era when we didn't have to test pharmaceutical products before they were put to market. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe, but that's really what it was. And it was also during a time when pharmaceuticals were new anyway. They were like a novelty. So before pharmaceuticals, you couldn't really get, for example, a sleeping pill. But sleeping pills became quite common after World War II, which is why it was invented in Germany, because a lot of people couldn't sleep due to shell shock. So the pharmaceutical companies jumped on, and by chance one day during a not clinical trial, because they didn't do that either, it was revealed that it had an amazing property to help women with morning sickness. So this drug thalidomide was used extensively around the world until about 1961, 62. They started to get suspicious because the sheer number of deformities, which, like Nick Vujicic, missing all four limbs was very common. But Nick is not a thalidomide survivor. And I know that's nitpicking, but the reality is what the drug did mimics a condition inside the womb for some women, very rare, that the limbs just don't grow properly for whatever reason. Now, as bizarre as that sounds, and as perhaps disturbing as that sounds, I can tell you, I'd rather be born without arms and say losing an arm or a limb like a lot of our wounded warriors, etc. So really, I was born totally normal. And it's not just kind of a motivational speaker cliche, which is what I do for a living, right, Chris? It is a real story. And of course, my real story is not just about me. And I look forward to telling you who it really is on during this podcast, because I owe a lot to a lot of people for making the Alvin Law you see today.
Yeah. I'm reading that as soon as you were born, yeah, you were rejected by your parents. And that's a really, really terrible thing, because I'm going to be honest with you, Alvin. My mother had me when she was 45. And during that time, anybody in the 60s who have children at 45, there's a lot of deformities. But
Yep.
I consider myself blessed by God that that didn't happen. And when I asked my family about my mother, who might have decided to use thalidomide, no, she didn't. She opted to not have any medication. She gave up smoking, she gave up drinking, and she had all 7 of us, no problem. But yeah, I can
Wow.
imagine with thalidomide. I've seen a documentary on that. It's just terrible. Um, so tell me about the time when, I guess during the school, that there might have been some really bad bullying, not just because of, like I was bullied when I was a kid, but bullied because making fun of you, and that, you had no arms and you couldn't defend yourself.
It's actually quite interesting. There is no doubt that I didn't get away scot-free from being bugged or made fun of by some kids. But, I think everything really should be focused. In any story like mine, we have to seriously keep in mind the era. We're here in 2023. We have a different take on bullying because it got to the public consciousness. But here's a really stark fact for you, Chris. Bullying is more common in the workplace than it is in schools.
Wow, really?
They've put a face to it that it's one bad teenager picking on another teenager who's not so perfect. That's true. But workplace bullying, they say, is almost 10 times more happening more in the workplace, in our communities. Schools get a lot of focus because, of course, nobody should pick on a kid. Well, nobody should pick on anybody. But I got to warn you, Chris, some of my answers might not sound like what people would expect. First of all, I think, to back up for just a moment, I was given up when I was 5 days old, and that sounds like a bad thing. But in fact, I've had a lot of time to think about that. And it occurred to me a long time ago, how lucky was I that somebody came to the hospital and took me home when my birth family didn't even want me. So would I have wanted to go home with my birth family? Probably not. But no one ever knows for sure, except my situation. I was able to meet my birth family in 1993. And I was able to get all the answers as to what exactly happened. And it's a long story, so I'll make it extremely short. They were overwhelmed by the reality of a medical prognosis in 1960 that I would have 0 quality of life. Now, this may sound like a little bit of a leap, Chris, but my birth family were fine. There was nothing wrong with them, except they would never, especially my birth mom, have pushed me to independence, because one of the common threads amongst all thalidomide survivors, especially the moms, they felt guilty. So they would take care of their deformed child differently than a regular child, which meant their children didn't learn the same skills as I did. That is an answer to your bully question, because my mom was one thing, but my dad was another. He was an ex-professional boxer. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall. He weighed 235 pounds. But here was the key. He was a service manager for a huge farm implement dealership, International Harvester. And because he had a bunch of mechanics under his charge, he believed in the theory of there's always something we can do to fix a problem. And we don't fix problems by getting violent. We don't fix problems by being angry. We certainly don't fix problems by blaming. So when it came to kids making fun of me, I learned to just let it roll off my back like water off a duck. I wasn't being courageous, but I wasn't about to fight. But what it actually did, and this is the part that can be a little controversial, I'm glad I was bullied, because it taught me to stand up for myself. And I'll tell you what, nobody pushes me around today, Chris. I've had a whole lifetime of teaching people how to treat me. And if one more thing about bullying I'd like to add, just to say it, we always talk about the victim. We rarely talk about the bully. The bully is half the time have their own mental health challenges, which brings out that rather inappropriate behavior. No, man, I had a great childhood. Yeah, I got picked on a bit. Sure, I got laughed at, got made fun of, but whatever. Talk about welcome to adolescence, right?
Yeah, I know. But how did you manage to do things that you need arms to do?
Well, that was another key. This is so ironic what I'm going to say next. We didn't have internet. So my mom couldn't exactly Google no arms, right? She couldn't, Siri, what do we do? Is there a YouTube video for this? No, it was all about creativity. But I also believe, you talk about God, I'm not overly religious, but I do believe in God. My mom said God gave her the task of raising me. So mom was not going to give up on me because her faith was extremely strong. But she learned from raising my brothers in the 30s and 40s. My dad fought in World War II. So my dad was gone from my brother's childhood home for 4 years. Mom became very creative and very inventive, but she adapted and adopted a don't give up philosophy for life. Now, I know that sounds warm and fuzzy, Chris, but it's true. So when it came to me, it was by the process of failure that I learned to succeed. I learned the first thing I ever learned to do, if you can believe this or not. I have memories that only go to about 3 years old, nothing much before that. Around 3 years old, my mom taught me to sew. So
Really?
I take a needle in my left toe, thread in the right toe, thread the needle, tie a little knot, sew buttons on rags, 20 at a time. Mom would cut them off and say, do it again. Dad was a mechanic, so he'd bring home nuts and bolts of different weights and sizes. So I would screw them on and off and on and off and on and off for hours at a time. Why?
Really?
So someday I could be a podcast and dazzle people? No, because mom and dad knew life A was going to be hard on me, but B, there was no teacher. There was no example. There was no documentation. And I know that sounds crazy, but there just wasn't. We didn't have the public knowledge we have now. So in fact, mom was inventing everything. But here was the key. I was participating in regular everyday life. And if I couldn't play basketball, I didn't play basketball. If I couldn't play quarterback, I was the kicker. If I couldn't play baseball because I couldn't hold a bat, I was the pinch runner. See, there was always a way. Now, soccer, that's a whole different thing. I had the advantage there, so, Chris, I never got the penalty for touching the ball with my hands. and more importantly, my dad was British. So his favorite game was, as he called, football. So imagine, I'm looking for something to do. I played football. But sports was not going to be my future. Music was.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about music-wise. So when you're playing the keyboard, for instance, how did you manage to play the keyboard when you need dexterity? Do you have dexterity, you think, in your foot?
So I wish I could show you. These are my feet. They're pretty big in the TV right now, but I can move them independently. I just learned how to move my toes independently.
Wow.
But I think what was the key was using my feet meant they became very strong. I have extremely strong feet. My wife tells me, you don't realize how strong your feet are. But the piano was not the first instrument. In fact, to be quite honest with you, I didn't think I would ever be a musician either, because I tried playing the piano just at a friend's house. Mom and dad were playing cards. I was farting around playing chopsticks, and mom was pretty impressed, right? So she took me to a piano teacher, and the piano teacher, may seem like she was being incredibly rude, looked at my toes and said, as you're thinking, Chris, they're just too short. I can't really play the piano. So why waste my parents' money and her time to teach me something that I will never play? Now, that's not offensive. It just is honest, to be quite frank. But here was the deal. She may have been right, but she didn't extend her imagination enough to try to figure out a solution like my parents typically would. So real quick, my favorite story, which leads back to the piano, was mom got a phone call about a year later from a new band director who had come to town named Blaine McClary in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. And he had instituted a new policy of music exams. So they were tests to determine your music ability. And I got like 96% on the test. So he phones my mom saying, we want Alvin in the band. Mom goes, do you have an instrument in mind? And mom goes, the band director, sorry, goes, no, I have no idea. In fact, with that kind of talent, why don't we just let him pick any instrument he wants? So then mom says, well, you're new to town. You haven't met Alvin, have you? Well, no. Why? Is that important? Mom's like, yeah, he kind of has no arms. And the band director, apparently, I wasn't there for the phone call, it went dead. He didn't drop the phone, but he was like incredulous. He couldn't figure out, A, how he got into this mess making a call to my mom, but B, how to answer. So essentially he said, well, certainly, Mrs. Law, you'd acknowledge. I mean, I can't believe that he's got no arms. I've never, ever heard of that. And mom said, well, yeah, well, he uses his feet. And then band director guy says, well, I don't see how that's a solution. I'm sorry to be, blunt, Mrs. Law, but there's no way we can have a kid in the band with no arms. Now, I want to acknowledge something. This was all acceptable behavior then, and it still is around now. We don't look at a person with no arms or legs and think of him as an achiever like Nick Vujicic, right? But look what he's done. I think that's why people like me are an inspiration to people, which I will accept with humility. But I think the real problem here, more than anything, is we're still working on 2023, seeing people with disability as people first. It's just the way it is. I'm not lecturing. I'm not preaching. The band director was a great man, and him saying what he said was absolutely accurate. The difference was mom had planted this little seed, almost like a piece of sand in his shoe, and he just couldn't get rid of it. It kept bugging him and bugging him. And one day in the staff room, he's just chatting about this woman he talked to with a kid with no arms. Well, the guy in the staff room was a teacher that went to our church. He said, oh, that's Alvin Law. Oh, he's amazing. He does everything with his feet. He's going to school. He's printing. He's drawing. He's coloring. He bowls with his mom. He curls with his dad. And this band director's going, you're kidding me. No. So they sat around brainstorming, and they came up with a way for me to play an instrument. In fact, what I'm going to do, Chris, just let me look downwards away from the camera for a minute, because I've actually got my book here, and I'd love to be able to even just show you a picture of this. But he calls my mom back about 6 weeks later. He says, I think I've got an instrument for Alvin to play. It was a trombone.
Oh,
Mounted on the side. Yeah, trombone mounted on the side of a wooden chair. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the right page with the picture.
wow.
And I played with my right foot. So you can imagine I'm sitting there playing a trombone with my right foot, left foot on the floor plate to give me stability. I've almost got it here, buddy. And imagine the idea too of really how good could I possibly be on a trombone. Well,
Wow.
Interesting enough, I was the #1 ranked high school jazz trombone player in Canada in 1978. So we figured it out.
Congratulations. Wow.
Yeah, we figured it out. And I think the bottom line to all of this is, what if Mr. McClary hadn't phoned back? I wouldn't be having this conversation with you today, because it became the portal for me to participate in life. And that was the most important thing. Anyway, I give up. I can't find the page. But you can imagine I'm playing like this. The trouble was, how can I put this without sounding a little bit weird? I never knew at first if people were going to take me seriously. So I became a bit of an overachiever on trombone, which meant I wanted to try playing everything. That's how I ended up learning to play the piano on my own, because it drove me nuts. But more than anything, music became a very big part of my life. And that's how I got into drums, because I was into jazz. I went to jazz camp. We're all messing around, jamming with each other. I found a pair of sticks. I put them between my toes. I sat behind a set of drums and started farting around. I wasn't any good at the time, but the other director there at this camp, who was a drum instructor, showed me a technique of how to play with my toes, and then showed me a way to play the whole kit. And a year ago, in 2 weeks, on the 20th and 21st of November last year, I played drums in a concert where the headliner in Tokyo, Japan, was Katy Perry.
Katy Perry.
So you can, yeah. So I'm actually a world-class drummer, more so than I am a trombone player now. But again, that's not how I make my living. It's how I've how I've enhanced my life to give me nothing but joy. Music totally incredibly important to me. But the only thing that I regret, I don't have time to be in a band. I wish I could be in a band. I'm old enough now to be in a casino band, aren't I? You know, like Trooper or April Wine or somebody Canadian.
Yeah, but if you wanted to actually play poker, you'd be out of luck, my friend.
Ah, you got
All seriousness aside, yeah, wow. Are you familiar with Tommy McAuliffe?
That name doesn't ring a bell right this second, Chris.
Okay, so he was a world-renowned golfer, and look him up. So when he was 8 years old, he had his arms cut off by a train, and he started learning to play golf by putting the golf club in between his neck and go like this. And
Really?
he did a lot more better than all the professionals with two arms out there.
Wow.
Yeah. So never look down and say, you know, I don't have any arms, I don't have any legs, I can't do anything. You would not believe who I've seen, even like incredible. For instance, I don't know if you're familiar with the drummer from Def Leppard, who literally, Rick Allen, he lost his arm and he learned to play the drums with one arm. So yeah, my friend, I mean, anything's
I've never
possible.
met him. I've had people tell me we should get together sometime. But a band that I did meet that I got a very special gift was Rush.
Oh wow!
And
So you
I
met
got
Geddy Lee and Neil Peart?
I met Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson in a meet and greet at a concert in Red Deer, Alberta in 2013 during the Calgary flood. In fact, that story alone is a fascinating story. There was a video filmed in my show, and I wish I could show you this today, but you know, people can look up alvinlaw.com at their leisure and see how I play the drums. But what I do in my speech, and this was a one for 2,000 students in Niagara Falls at an Ontario Student Leadership Conference in 2012, I just play a snare drum. And I use the snare drum, like most of the stories of my life, Chris, they're meant to be not metaphorical, but examples. You know, like this is why I do this. This is the story behind this. When I heard the documentary come out, Beyond the Lighted Stage, the excellent Rush documentary, there's a segment where Neil Peart talks about being an awkward adolescent. And boy, he was. He looked pretty bad when he was a teenager. And how he said it, this exact quote, drums became his instrument of self-esteem. So that particular day, in front of 2,000 students, there had to be more than one holding their phone, filming this to put on YouTube, and they did. So the segment very quickly was me showing how I play the snare drum. But the idea of how it was therapy for me when I was struggling as an adolescent, and we already talked about this, not because I was getting made fun of, but I was having trouble getting comfortable in my skin. You know, we all go through that phase where we call ourselves ugly. And, you know, Body Imperfect was around back then, too. So I would go in my basement and play to my drums. And I wanted to play as good as Neil Peart, who didn't as a drummer. And how, if there was a word for impossible, it should be Neil Peart. But I tried. So I mentioned all this in this little segment, how I would listen to bands like Rush and I would just play and play and play because I just couldn't give up on my life. And who knows, maybe because of that and the drums, maybe they actually saved my life because of what they gave me for my own mental health. That's a real story. Wow, that got shown on YouTube. That made its way to Rush. And before I know it, I got invited to be in the front row for a concert in Calgary until we had the flood. Then they had to move it to Red Deer. So I took my son, who's now 38, and we had a boys' night out. Was it ever fun? Front row center. And just before the concert, we had the meet and greet, but Neil Peart didn't do meets because he was too shy. Bummer. I wanted to meet Neil Peart. But 5 minutes before the concert started, the drum tech comes to the front row, gives me a pair of Neil Peart's drumsticks and says, my boss asked me to give you these because he watched the video. He was blown away by you, sir. And he wanted to say thank you with a pair of his own drumsticks that he used to play 3 nights ago in Cincinnati. So again, I don't have them handy here. I should have thought of this. But whenever I hold Neil Peart's drumsticks, who of course we lost, I can literally feel the energy in those sticks. So, you know, probably more than anything, I'm just proud to call myself more than a survivor of thalidomide. I'm a drummer, man.
Yes, yes. And how many times in your life has someone said to you, "Hi, Alvin"? Oh, sorry.
All the time, all the time. And guess what I can do?
What? Shake with your foot.
Shake it. I do. I warn them. I say, if you're serious, I'll shake your hand. But if you're not so sure, just give me a hug, like hugging a
Oh,
tree.
that's awesome. So, what happens if you broke a toe or a foot?
Well,
How would
I've
that
only
happen?
ever had the bad fortune of spraining my ankle once. And ironically, that was when I was playing pinch runner in a baseball game when I was like 12. I
Hmm.
just sprained my ankle. I broke my toe, same toe, twice. Not serious break, but just stubbed it on bad furniture. But I've been very lucky, knock on wood, that I've never had any serious injuries to my legs or feet. My wife made me stop downhill skiing because she was worried that I might break a leg. She said, if you break a leg, we won't have a job, because that's what I do, is speak for a living. So I had to quit
Yeah.
skiing. But you know what? To be quite blunt about this too, I had learned from a very early age to never take my body for granted. You gotta be grateful for what you're able to do. I know
Hmm.
that sounds, again, a little bit preachy, but I think a lot of risk takers, people that are extreme athletes, they've signed the document. If something bad happens to them, it's on them. So I was never quite that risky. But I will also say this: I never shied away from trying something like skiing. I mean, I didn't think I was going to ski until I moved to Calgary in 1978 to go to broadcasting school, and just happened to be one of my roommates loved to ski. And he said, I'll take you skiing. The bugger took me to the very top of Lake Louise our first time there and left me alone to suffer with a double black diamond run. That's a whole other story. But the reality is, I always wanted to try stuff because what I believe from the bottom of my heart, Chris, we only get one life. We shouldn't let it go to waste.
Yeah, I understand that, Alvin. That's interesting. Now, you said somewhere in there that you had a son. Can you give us a little bit of a background of how it was for relationships in high school and how you met your wife?
That's a very good question, and I love the idea. If we're going to talk about why I did not have a good adolescence, then let's talk about lack of a girlfriend. Right? I'm heterosexual, so did I want to date? Of course I did. Did they want to hold my foot? Let's just say no. And it wasn't at the time okay with me because I was immature. Right?
Mm,
Weren't we all? Look how bad people can take a breakup when you're 15 years old, right?
yeah.
So I just put up with it. The irony was, in an era when we didn't do this, my son's life, they did. He's, like I said, born in 85. I had lots of friends who were girls. So these girls were friends. They loved that I would listen to them. Little lesson for life, gentlemen: listen to the wife.
Hmm.
Anyway, the reality is, I was a listener. And not only did that develop as a very important skill for life, but it made me very popular with women. And ironically, they almost always seemed to be really attractive women, because the men that were attracted to them tended to think of them as, dumb blondes, for example.
Hmm.
So I didn't really have a serious relationship until my 20s. And then unfortunately, I made one of those little tiny mistakes and got a gal pregnant. And we weren't even together. We were just dating. But then
Hmm.
we were forced to marry. Again, no disparaging, but we were a religious family. So you have to get married. I'm glad that's not as important anymore today as it was back then. But Dance was born. And then unfortunately, or again, depends how you look at it, my ex and I knew we were never going to last. So that marriage ended very quickly, and less than 2 years later. But her problem was she had increasingly difficult mental health problems.
Hmm.
Um, Probably comes from her family. Her parents were both alcoholics, that old story. But more than anything, I realized what I had done, and this is going to sound a little judgmental. For everything in my life, I've raised my bar. I'm going to do better. I'm going to do better. I'm going to do better. But when it came to a relationship, I lowered my bar. Because
Hmm.
obviously, who's going to want to love me, right?
Oh,
Who's going to want to go out with a guy without arms? Who's going to want to be intimate with a guy that has to use his feet to hold somebody's hand or even hold them in a hug? Well, you know what? I'm living proof that there's always somebody out there who has an ironic, similar take on the world. And I met Darlene in 1991 at a conference when I was a single dad because my ex-wife's mental problems led to her not being able to take care of Vance for months at a time. He eventually came to live with us when he was 8. Darlene and I, we got married in 93. But here's my family. Now, if you look at Darlene,
Wow.
people see Darlene, they go, wow, is she ever beautiful? I know. Look at her. That's a pretty nice family, huh? Yeah. Why am I showing it to you? To brag? No.
Well,
To
if you
show
can find a
people
girl, I
watching-
can too then.
Yeah. I mean, again,
Wow.
what was it? I have a joke.
Inspirational.
Yeah, well, I have a joke. When I saw her, she was around maybe a little bit younger than that picture. That's an old picture, by the way. It's an old book. When I saw her, I fell for her because she was beautiful. But it was her laugh that got me. It was this beautiful laugh, beautiful smile, this positive, radiating energy, right? But she was taken. Well, what I didn't know was she was not yet untaken, but at the end of a divorce or at the beginning of a divorce. So we got to know each other. When the divorce ended, she moved to Regina so we could be a couple. And when I asked her to marry me in 1992, I couldn't believe it. I mean, all the way through this, I'm going, look who I'm with, look who I'm with. And I know, again, why I was attracted, because she's beautiful. But why was she attracted to me, Chris? I don't think it was the biceps. I call attitude a human magnet. It works both ways. It can draw people in towards you, or it can repel people away from you. So whenever we want to do an attitude check, the first step we should take is looking at our friends. Do our friends do nothing but complain about the world? Do our friends do nothing but get mad at politics? Do our friends do nothing but just hate the world? Or do we surround ourselves with people who are the opposite? Chris, if you met my friends, it'd be like a Woodstock concert. Everybody's just at a love-in, right? We all love our lives. We all love our worlds. Some of my friends are extremely successful. Others, not so much. What does success mean? Well, again, success to me is not about the money in your bank account, but it's about what you feel when you go to bed every night and say, thank God for my life.
This is very inspirational, Alvin. No wonder you had you shared a riveting story with over 2 million people on 5 continents and 7,500 events. And I hope many of them have taken that home with them. I mean, like, really, you're so inspirational. I wanted to ask you, so what about the label disabled, disability? You can't do anything because you have no arms. And look at me, I can do anything I want. What? Am I under the impression you don't like those labels?
Well, first of all, I think a label is not a permanent marker. And I think that a label is something that is also in itself very controversial. I don't want to open a Pandora's box here, but when we began the LGBTQ movement towards equality, let's remember this didn't start out with that. If I can be really honest, the label started with feminism. If you think about it, I've thought a lot about this. Women were not being treated as equals. It started a very important dialogue. That dialogue extended to everything that was something that made us uncomfortable. Strong women made men uncomfortable, right? Gay men made people uncomfortable. Gay women made people more uncomfortable. Then we started to examine other things that made us uncomfortable. And believe it or not, disability was one of them. We just couldn't deal with the fact that we weren't comfortable as a society with someone who drooled, okay? Or someone who didn't speak properly, or someone who couldn't hear properly.
Or Down syndrome.
So that's even worse, because that had another stigma attached to it, where the evil of the mind, deranged people, the mentally ill, we locked them up, and everybody was happy because we're locking them up. And we forgot we were locking up people. We were putting them in a cage just like an animal in the zoo. And when everything started to shift, when people started closing these mental health institutions, when unfortunately the homeless population was a direct descendant of that, sadly enough. But my point is this: when I talk about labels, labels are rarely self-applied. It's other people that are putting the label on you. But we've almost now gone the other direction where we're saying, I want to be proud of my difference. Fine. We've all got a cause. My cause was never as much about advocacy for the world of disability, but self-advocacy so I could have an abundant life. But I also agree. Do you know what's interesting though, Chris? They used to call the Cerebral Palsy Association in the UK the United Kingdom Spastic Society, right?
What?
When I was a kid, they called us crippled. Even worse, you know, when I was young, even going back into the earlier part of the 30s and 40s and stuff in North America, they used to put people without arms in circus sideshows.
If you had, I guess if you had been born a little earlier, maybe you probably would have been put in a sideshow. But I think they dealt with those and they got rid of them, I think, what, the 50s, the 60s or something?
You know, that's, yes, generally speaking, Chris. But here's a little fun fact. Did you know that I played an armless preacher on an episode of X-Files in 1996?
I'm actually a big X-Files fan. I don't remember that episode.
So if you go to Netflix, if it's still on Netflix, that wasn't a commercial, by the way. If you go to Netflix, go to season 2, the episode is called Humbug. And humbug, of course, was the word used by Barnum to talk about the sideshows that they had. By the way, I'm not saying this was okay, but here's the deal. They're still around. They happen at fringe festivals. I've met several people that are human whatevers, okay? I got on X-Files because it was the episode about Scully and Mulder going to investigate the murder of the alligator man in a swimming pool by a symbiotic twin that detaches itself from his host and goes around killing people.
Yeah, I remember that one now. You're right. Yeah.
All right. So what am I saying? That was a mainstream, extremely popular television show that played on the dark side of our society. There's a dark side in our society, Chris, whether we like to admit it or not. There's all kinds of strange things that go on. We could even put this into the category of Comic-Cons, when people dress up and want to behave differently. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying let's celebrate people who have the courage to live their authentic lives. I mean, I'm glad I'm not in a sideshow. But, you know, when I was in Tokyo last November, the show was called the True Colors Festival. People want to look that up. True Colors Festival with no U. It was a huge concert in Japan, but 2 nights, 9,000 people for each showing. But the 10 acts were blended acts of people with and without disability. And the idea, that is the essence of diversity and inclusion. Not this warm and fuzzy human resources department trying to get you out of a job so they can hire somebody with a minority on their box. Right. No, that's a narrow-minded approach to diversity and inclusion. To me, diversity and inclusion is very simple. We have a planet of 7 billion plus people, and we're all our own human. Let's respect that. And let's say to people, if you can do the job and you got no arms, great. If somebody can do the job because they've got them, great. Let's stop messing around with all this politics and just recognize human beings is the equation here.
So you weren't ever, now this isn't a joke, but you weren't ever tempted like, okay, sorry, Mr. Law, we decided to hire with more experience. Oh, you're not hiring me because I have no arms, right? Did you ever get tempted to say that? Or was your thought, oh, that's okay. That's okay. No.
So here's a very, very uncomfortable topic for some individuals to hear, but I'm just going to say it. Part of my upbringing, especially my dad, was you will never get a job out of sympathy, Alvin. You will earn every job you get, which means you need to be the best prepared candidate for the job. So when I decided I was going to go into radio in 1978, I didn't just go into a radio station and say, hire me because you feel sorry for me. I went to school for 2 years in Calgary and studied broadcasting and got a diploma. And while I was there, I made sure that I ended up at near the top of the class. So when I sent out my applications, they would go, oh, look, he had a straight A's. This guy's obviously pretty good, or this gal's really talented. So when I went to do my first job interview, absolutely true story, I walk in and the station manager in Regina says, you're Alvin Law? I went, yeah. He says, oh, I wasn't really expecting this because nowhere on your application did it say you have no arms. So I said, well, my 2-year college program didn't have a problem with it, and I graduated with honors. You also invited me to an interview, so obviously you don't have a problem with it. Besides, what's a guy without arms supposed to sound like anyway? Now, in retrospect, that was a little bit disrespectful because what was this guy? It wasn't his fault. He didn't expect to have a guy walk in without arms. But that was 1980, and I got a job. And every job that I've gotten, I have been hired to do. I've never been fired from any job. And in 1988, I had a government job that was paying me, what was it? $67,000 a year to be a government manager. Wow. And I walked into my boss's office one day and said, I quit. And she thought I was nuts because doesn't everybody want a government job, you know, for security? Well, I quit because I had an idea. I wanted to be a motivational speaker. So why not give it a try? So I started in 1988 and here we are. I haven't looked back.
Yeah. It says that you have extremely rare credentials. Now, wouldn't Nick Vujicic, since he's a motivational speaker, shouldn't he have the same credentials as well?
You don't have to have any credentials in this business. But what I had decided I wanted to do for the reasons we're talking about right now is I did not know this. I couldn't join in Regina because they didn't have one then. But when we moved here in 2000, I joined the Canadian Association of Professional Speakers. That was very important to me. A, to be a member of my peer group, but B, to figure out from those who'd been there, done that, how I could take my profession in my own life and my business to a new level. So we joined, I started going because we went, you found out there's a thing called the Certified Speaking Professional designation, which is an earned designation. It's all about reputation, client testimonials, different tracks of how many speeches you've done in a year, your income, it goes on and on and on. Anyway, I got that in 2005. I was inducted into the Canadian Professional Speakers Hall of Fame, excuse me, in 2009. And when did I get this? In 2021, early, I got designated as a virtual certified speaker as well. Why? Because I'm not trying to impress people, Chris. But what I'm saying is exactly what you said already. I want to be qualified, but that's me. I'm not saying it's bad if you use a service with your disability to get a job, or even if you decide you want to play the disabled card, that's absolutely your prerogative. I wouldn't do that, but that's me. But that's also a lot to do with my being 63 years old.
If you were offered the ability to have arms, like now that people who lose their arms can have actually arms attached now, would you want that? Would you want 2 arms attached to you so you can live your life, remainder of your life with arms?
Well, I want to make sure I find the picture this time because I think it's a really good example. When I was adopted, I was not really adopted. I was put into foster care. And what that meant was my foster parents had to use the medical services and rehabilitation that was recommended to them. They couldn't really turn down something like artificial arms. So when I was 3 years old, I got my first pair of artificial arms. Now you tell me, Chris, do I look happy?
No.
So
could
I wasn't happy. I had no choice.
I mean, like,
hospitals.
You need shoulder muscles.
Put them on my shoulders.
Yeah.
It was weird how they worked. It's hard even seeing in the picture how they worked, but they were controlled by straps on my legs that held wire cables that ran up to the shoulders, then down to the arms, onto the hook. So if I wanted to open the hook, I would pull on it and it would open the hook. The elbows had gears that were locking gears. So you could bounce your arm and the arm would go and lock into position. This was the kind of the ugly child, sorry to use that expression, of the artificial limbs that were made post-World War II. because there was a lot of amputees, right? Due to IEDs, etc. We didn't call them that back then. But the point is, there was nothing malicious going on, Chris. They honestly had no history in medical records of having no arms from birth. It was just that rare until thalidomide. Well, then all of a sudden, they had to do something. So the only knowledge they had, and this is a good thing in Canada, was with the knowledge base of War Amputations Canada, or War Amps. War Amps were very, very experienced at training how to use artificial limbs, but the key was you had to have had them first. You can't simply put on a pair of arms if you've never had them and instinct kicks in. My brain never saw arms ever because they didn't grow. They weren't there and disappeared. They just didn't grow. So my brain, like your brain does every day, everyone does this, was learning who I was by observation. So when I use my feet, okay, I'm going to show you with a glass. When I use my feet to have a drink like this, okay? You couldn't learn to do this. I mean, you could try, but I guarantee you spill over yourself.
Maybe if I practice, maybe I could.
Maybe if you practiced, you could. But here is the key and why I brought this up. The arms didn't help me. They hindered me. The trouble is, it took the medical people till I was 15 years old to figure this out. And when I was 15 years old, I was getting a little bit of an attitude, right? And I basically told them, these are useless. And by the way, your threat of removing me from my foster home if they don't comply with you is not going to fly, because you're not in charge of me anymore. I'm in charge of me now. And that was just the way it was, right? But here's the best answer to your question ever, Chris. In May, my wife and I spent 4 days in Georgetown at Georgetown University, where I was involved in a 3-day experiment using an MRI machine where they were mapping pathways in my brain connected to my activity with my toes. It was a very unique experiment. They put me in the MRI machine, put on VR goggles, and I would toggle buttons with my toes, and they mapped the hot spots in my brain, which is where they will do the implants for the next generation of myoelectric bionic arms, given largely to wounded warriors who've lost them in conflict. So here you go. I want to say this, Chris. I was never bitter towards the medical community for what they put me through, because I was so well raised. Mom always said to me, you're just doing your part to help medicine, Alvin. Good for you. You deserve a medal, just like your dad got in World War II. She always used to say that. You're a little warrior. You deserve a medal like your dad got in World War II. And that was really very motivational for me, because I wanted to be important, and I wanted to be a hero, and I wanted to make a difference. And maybe that's why I decided to go into speaking, not for my ego, but to honor the life that I've been given.
Wow, you're so inspirational, my friend. So
Thank you.
Did you keep those arms, those old
No.
ones for remembrance? No.
No, and what was really fascinating was my kind of aggressive attitude at 15 years old was really fascinating, because I would find out that there was 2 arms. And by the way, in 1975, I had electric arms with real looking hands and little tiny buttons in the shoulder that I'd push inside with my little shoulder to make them move. And the first generation of rechargeable batteries, they were very, very heavy. So again, they were very good science for the time. But when I got belligerent and got them to take them back, I found out that 2 other amputees were able to use 1 arm each, because they'd lost their arms both in farming accidents. So they were able to take those arms that they had made for me, because they weren't custom made in terms of a mold. They just kind of fit on a device that held your like a brace that you put on your upper body. So again, Chris, I'm just going to say this. A lot of times people think I'm so inspiring, and that's very, very kind, and they kind of go, yeah, you know what? You don't sound like this. This is put on, right? You're not really like this. I'm really like this, because I think what happened to me molded the person that I became, because I learned how to not only teach people how to treat me, but to recognize the world is not ever intentionally ignorant, right? We don't know what we don't know, and then we learn. I mean, COVID taught us that, didn't it? COVID taught all of us at the exact same time that we were experiencing something that had never happened before. So we could either go through it with anger and ignorance, or we could learn as much about it as possible to get us through the mental health struggles that COVID represented. But it also taught us there's some pretty smart people out there, aren't there?
There are, and I also know that there's a lot of high-level quadriplegics that can actually do quite an amazing portrait with the paintbrush in their mouth.
Yeah.
Excellent, super, and using a paintbrush in their foot. And yeah, very inspirational. I think you're inspirational. I take it that those that show up at many of your meetings, a lot of them have like different disabilities, like no arms and one arm and no legs and stuff like that. None of
Actually,
them
no,
appear.
Chris, here's what's interesting. I probably only speak to rooms with people with disabilities in them maybe once a year.
Wow.
Yeah, no, and that's not intentional. I don't avoid them. I'll give you an example. My highlight reel of the year was in Nashville at the end of June. I spoke to 6,500 people in the Nashville Convention Center to an organization called the $1 Million Round Table. The $1 Million Round Table are insurance salespeople from around the world who have written a minimum of $1 million in 1 year campaign. So these are all very successful insurance underwriters. They're very type A personalities. They would be the more common audience for me. People that are looking to improve their own professional skills, sales teams, organizational teams, associations that have membership you have to join to. I have a little cheeky line, Chris. I have the target audience that I have. If your organization has human beings, I'm your speaker. Because I am there actually to do the opposite of talking to people with disabilities. You know, yeah, I've done it. I don't know how it always goes across. I can come across as being a bit of an overachiever, I guess. I don't know. All I know is I got only 365 days in a calendar year. But also what dictates this are the meeting planners that are looking for a very powerful, it's kind of almost generic, entertaining speaker to leave an audience feeling better about themselves, but also leaving an audience knowing we can always do better.
So do you get a lot of people at these meetings go up to you and say, "Oh, Mr. Law, can I help you with anything? Oh, what
Oh,
can I
sure.
do for you?" Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your
But you
response
know
to
what?
them?
Well, first of all, I'm never against people helping me. In fact, this is just a personal observation. All right. I don't want to keep using COVID as an example, but COVID definitely, post-COVID, I noticed a difference in human behavior, a kinder, gentler society. We may not think that, but I've seen it. It used to be if I'm standing waiting for my luggage, let's just say, to come off a carousel because I just got off a plane because I travel a lot, right? People, if they were asked, would help me. Would you mind helping me with my bag? Sure. Since COVID, I hate this cliche. I almost have to beat them off with a stick. There's people coming over to me automatically before I even open my mouth. Let me know if I can help you. Let me know if I can get that for you. Let me know if I can give you some assistance. I'll go to open my car door, and people will race over to open the door of my car, even though I can drive a regular car.
Wow,
I've
yeah, I've
noticed.
seen that.
I really believe this, Chris. I believe that we're a better society in 2023 than we were in 2020. I just do. Now, do we have flaws? Absolutely. But I would advise anybody with a disability, okay, this is just my advice. Never be rude to someone trying to be kind to you. That's just wrong.
I know that when I sprained my ankle and I was on crutches, you had all these people, "Huh, can I help you with the door?" I'm like, sure, sure, sure. And in the end, they don't want anything to do with you because you're okay now. You're
Yeah,
normal like me, so you don't need people to open the door. You can do it yourself. But when you couldn't, yeah, sure, I'll be there. So,
that's
but
funny.
do you have to bring someone with you when you go on trips to help you with the luggage and how would you open the hotel door with your foot with a key that
So
small between your
yeah. Well, first of all of my life, I've learned to adapt to my own independence. A lot
Wow.
of it was connected to dignity. I vividly remember when I couldn't get dressed myself. I just hadn't unlocked the key yet to that problem. I hadn't figured it out. But when they started making pants, in particular, with elastic waistbands, I was able to use my own abilities, using my legs, almost like a yoga exercise,
Hmm.
to use the top of a toilet seat or the knob on a drawer or a hook that I have in my briefcase that I can suction cup to a wall to help me pull up my pants. My
Wow.
shirts are custom by my wife. If you can see this, she sews up the sleeves, but I would just put this over my head. Now you see this has a zipper. I have a lot of these because buttons are not fun, but I can do a button. I've got a special instrument. It's almost like a little button hooker or a needle threader. It goes through your hole of your button and pulls it back through. But again, clothing was always the problem. So in the old days, back in 1978, when I went to college, I still needed someone to help me go to the bathroom. I could do the bathroom. I won't go into the gory details, but I needed someone to help me. Again, that's a real challenge to someone's dignity. But I was so outgoing that people almost, like I said, they would take turns helping me because, let's be honest, I think one of the greatest gifts we're all given as humans is to help somebody else. And when we help somebody else, don't we feel good? You know, we don't do it for that reason per se, I hope, but we do feel good. But I think at the end of the day, everything that I've learned to do has been about adapting. So when I had my first car, I don't use pockets. So what do I do with a key? Well, I'd keep it in my shoe. Hotel keys go in my shoe. Now they're cards, aren't they? So I can use a card to open a door. I pull it out of my shoe, tap it. Even more critical of a change in the world, we now have to put our card over a reader in the elevator so we can go up to our hotel. No problem. But again, there's always somebody to give me assistance 99% of the time. If I'm by myself, I figure it out. But I've never looked at a challenge as being an insult. It's a challenge. I want to figure this out. And when I get it, I win.
Good going. And I'm going to give you thumbs up, even though you can't, but thumbs up. Give me a
I can do toes up. How about toes up?
Toes up, man. So I take it you can't have a watch, or you can have an ankle watch, but can you have like a wallet in your pocket?
See this
How would you
bracelet?
remove it?
See my bracelet? I
How
also
would you
have a watch.
remove?
I don't have it on me right now, but I put on my own watch with my foot. I just put the
Wow.
straps around the side and do it up with my toes.
How do
I
you
didn't
take your
want to wear
wallet
a
out of
watch.
your pocket?
I don't use my pockets. I carry a man bag.
Oh, okay.
I've been carrying a bag around before Jerry Seinfeld made it popular.
Or the frilly shirt.
Yeah, I don't have one of those. But no, I used to, mom had it. See, this is like, again, Chris, I don't want to beleaguer this because it just sounds perfect world. It wasn't perfect world. But my mom was the seamstress. That's where I got the needle and thread. So when she knew I was going to go to school, we didn't even have the money to do this back then. So she made a canvas bag, put a leather strap on it so I could carry it over my shoulder and take my books to school. Remember, I don't know how old you are, Chris, but maybe some of your listeners would remember, we didn't have backpacks when we grew up. You know, those are new. Kids have backpacks now. Good for them. We didn't have those. People never used briefcases to go to school when you were in the 70s, unless you were a nerd, right? So I got made fun of for carrying a bag, believe it or not. And over the years, same thing. So I now have a man bag that just goes over my shoulders. But when I'm traveling on my own, I have a briefcase that has a strap. My suitcase doesn't have wheels because that doesn't do any good for me. So my suitcase has a strap that I carry over my head. I'm able to pack on my own, which means that I know don't take too much. Bottom line, I believe that my greatest gift I gave myself was the gift of discovery. You know, let me just figure that out. How can I do that? Let me just figure that out. And that's why I encourage others to think the same way. You know, we beat ourselves up too much, Chris. You know, we something goes wrong in our life and we just want to give up. Well, all I know is, people, never give up. Really, please, just never give up. Life's too valuable.
So how do you deal with snow then? If you can't really wear anything on your foot and you need them as hands, how do you deal with the snow when you have to go out?
I just have I've really warm, insulated winter shoes, not boots, because they would come up too high. I don't wear socks because that makes me useless. But yes, I don't like snow. But guess what? I still shovel it.
Is there a joke in there?
No, I do. I don't do it all the time. But if my wife's out there shoveling snow, I'll go out and help her. We've got a snow scoop. right? You know, one of those
Wow.
big things that has the bar on the top. I push it with my chest. Now, do I
Wow.
do it all the time? No. I got smart. I hired snow shoveling service.
Is there anything you can't do with your feet that person can do with their arms?
Change a light bulb in the ceiling, climb a ladder and clean out my gutters. I mean, really, at the end of the day, there's a lot of things I can't do. But also at the end of the day, there's a lot more things I can.
Wow, that's amazing. So what does, when it says here, Alvin loves to use the story as proof that attitude is so much more than the overused word. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, it's become a bit of its own cliche, right? People kind of laugh at it. Oh, just have a positive attitude. No, that's not the way to think of it. Attitude is a challenge. Attitude is also a habit. Hey, Chris, I'm just going to do one commercial. All right. Here's my book.
Yeah.
You can't get it on Amazon. Don't even bother going there. I use Amazon, but it's not a good place for booksellers. I'll tell you, if you're a self-published author, they can really rip you off. Just a little bit of a cautionary note on Amazon. But I wrote my own book, and I called it
Alvin's Law of Life, 5 Steps to Successfully Overcome Anything. Yeah, I was just going to, that was my next question. I'm going to ask you about the book.
So I didn't mean to plug my own book, but let me read what I wrote. Because my laws, there's 5 of them. Like I said, 5 steps to successfully overcome anything. And just wait, I'll just show you one more graphic here. This is just the physical graphic of how it looks like in the book.
Wow.
I don't know if you can see it there. It's the 5 laws spell Alvin, see? Alvin. So there's 5 laws. They're all one paragraph of a mission statement. They're attitude, learning, valuing your life, imagination, and never giving up. But let me read you what I wrote about attitude to answer your question. Attitude is more than just being positive. It's a way of looking at life, ours and everybody's. It is said to be everything because it is everything. It defines who we are and what we become. Wow. So that is my definition of attitude. It's how we perceive things. It's how we take things in. But more than anything, it's how we let things out. Do you ever get around someone you're around it for 30 seconds? It was 25 seconds too long? Because they're just an unhappy individual for whatever reason, with due respect. Well, that's attitude. You know, there's so many different cliches that I could give you as an example. But at the end of the day, attitude to me was always explained. It's the way you see your challenges, the way you overcome your obstacles, but more than anything, the way that you live every day of your life.
Alvin, is this the link? Should we include the link to your book on Amazon? It's 13. Was that 13 or 15? 15?
No, there's a few that are floating around out there that people bought that I went on to sell them to Amazon, and now they're maybe available there. But alvinlaw.com is the only place that you can really legitimately buy my book. By the way, if you buy one from Amazon, I don't get any profit from it at all.
Oh, really?
Only Amazon. No, that's part of the problem with Amazon is how their agreements work. It's a long story. Anyway, just alvinlaw.com.
Okay, I'll link it down below, and everyone, it'll be linked down for you to purchase it from them. I'm actually ordering a copy. I'm so glad I didn't order from Amazon now that I know. Whoa, I saved my money. Yeah, and it also says that you appeared in 100 telethons, and since 1976, you've been directly involved in raising over $225 million for charity. Way to go, Alvin! Woo, Alvin!
Thank you,
Alvin. That's awesome.
I believe in being generous as well.
Yeah. I see when you're in these conferences, you're sitting on this really small little stool in your butt, and you're like, am I going to fall? I don't have any way of catching myself. That must be scary for you. How do you handle that? Do they strap you down there or something?
One of the ironies that I learned, especially growing up, was center of gravity. You know, our bodies have a center of gravity. In women, it's basically in their rear end. It has a lot to do with child rearing. In men, it's generally in their shoulders or in their upper body. For whatever reason, strength was connected to that part of the body. With no arms, my center of gravity automatically shifted to my butt. So when I sit on a stool and I get into a position, I've never never fallen off a stool, just one time. And that was at home when I was a single dad trying to put up a real Christmas tree that I had brought in from a Christmas tree yard lot. And I was trying to pull it up by myself to put it in its stand, and it made it. And then it made it the other way, and it pushed me off the stool, and I fell. That was the only time I've ever fallen off a stool. I'm very, very conscious of my body. So my balance is also extremely talented. But everything that I do, I have to sit down. So if I'm using a stool, it's more than using demonstrations in my show. That's a pretty cool picture, though. I agree. I'm holding up, I think, a hairbrush or something.
Yeah.
I'm using stools around my house. So if I go in the kitchen, I don't do all the cooking, but I definitely do cooking, or, the dishes or whatever I'm doing, I have to sit down to do it. So I've designed my home, not specially designed, it's just a regular house that has stools. I probably got 7 or 8 stools in my house. So on every level, the basement, the main floor, or the second story, I've got stools. I've got a stool in my washroom, so I can sit on the stool to brush my teeth or wash my face or shave. But again, everything that I figured out through the years had a ton to do with how incredibly dexterous my toes are, but how incredibly strong my back is, my stomach, my core. You should see my core. It doesn't look pretty. It looks like a typical middle-aged man gut. But as my wife says, there's no beer in there. There's just muscle in there. So I'm really, really strong. But also where I'm really strong is in the kind of things that we normally wouldn't think about. I use my teeth to carry some things because that's how I'm able to do that. I just think at the end of the day, I'm so lucky at 63 that I can still do what I can do.
Does your wife worry about your well-being when she's not there? She goes, Alvin doesn't have arms. I have to be there to be his arms. Or is her attitude like, Alvin can do what he wants. I'm just going to have fun here.
Chris, if she was on the interview right now, she'd be on the floor laughing. No, she loves me. She loves me. She loves me. She loves me. But loving me is very much in her world. You can imagine she was married in her first life, the divorce I was speaking of, to an RCMP officer. And he was a fine guy. They just didn't, they stopped growing together. So she was looking to change her way of life and change her circle of friends. And when we met, we hit it off. But you can imagine me being introduced to her family when we were first seeing each other, and her family's going, okay, your last husband was 6 feet 2 inches tall, had very big upper strong arms, was very capable of doing everything, and now you're going out with a guy without arms. What are you thinking? And Darlene's answer was quite simple. There's no disrespect intended here, okay? But what she said is, when I met Alvin, he was running a household by himself with a 5-year-old boy. He was doing all of the family chores, doing the laundry, doing the vacuuming, taking care of the house, things that her ex-husband never did. So she said, in terms of abilities, let's stop looking at the macho body and let's start looking at the character of the human.
Wow. And for 63 years, you lived without arms, has a smile on your face, and people who lose their arm, 2 or 3 days later, they're going, I won't be able to do anything. I can't. And I'm like, are you nuts? And 63 years, you lived your life without arms, and you're doing so well. So if I could say, listen, come here, I want to have you introduce to someone, Alvin, and they're like, this person just lost their arm 2 days ago. This person just, whatever. Alvin's had no arms for 63 years, and look at that smile. You know what I mean? Perfect stuff.
Thank you.
What do people misunderstand about you the most?
That I miss having arms. And by the way, I wanted to add one thing to your comment, which was, by the way, quite accurate. People who lose their arm or a leg or something can find it extremely difficult to go on. But if you think about it, that makes perfect sense because they've lost an incredibly important part of their body. I would never expect them to just snap to it in 2 or 3 days, Chris. But I also acknowledge they're not dead. That's crude, but let's be blunt. They're still around. There's so much knowledge in our world today of amputees and what we can do to treat them after an accident. And I think at the end of the day, also, I hope I can inspire them. But I also understand that when someone may tell my story to someone who's just lost an arm, we can't compare this is apples and oranges, right? My arms never grew. I don't know what it's like to go through the trauma of being in a situation to lose a limb. But what I will say is never try to do this by yourself. There's so many resources out there. There's so many people, that are available to teach you. There's shows like this podcast, places where they can go to learn, YouTube. There's so many good things about the internet today, even though they're not all good, but they can be a real resource to people who find themselves faced with an incredible challenge. One of my favorite examples, and I didn't do this because I'm not an athlete, but I've known several Paralympians who basically said the same thing. They might have been in an accident where they, let's just say, were paralyzed and ended up paralyzed from the waist down. Then they end up in the Paralympics and they end up being on Team Canada and they end up winning a gold medal. And their comment is, I would have never, ever been to any kind of Olympics had I not ended up in a wheelchair. So it's all about putting it in perspective, right?
Another thing that you don't experience phantom limb because you never had it in the first place.
No, and it's very important that my body language even speaks to that. That's why if I was standing and walking or sitting on my stool, you notice I gesture with my feet.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, very natural procedure for me. My feet very much are my hands. I can't explain that to people because they can't imagine it. But I also think we do have a bit of a stigma towards feet. Some people don't think feet are very nice, or they think feet are dirty or they're stinky. Yeah, some feet are. Not my feet.
Yeah. It's sort of like, well, wash your hands for dinner. I guess your wife says, wash your feet for dinner.
Yes. That was what my mom used to say when I was a kid. Make sure you wash your feet before you eat. And I always argued because I'd go to the bathroom, I'd wash my feet, I'd walk back to the kitchen, they'd be dirty again.
So, Alvin, earlier on, I want to mention, I want to touch on this. Now, you said you met your birth family, I believe you said that?
Yes.
Now, did that intend your mom and your dad as well? Did you ever find out why she gave you up? Did it include your real parents as well?
So my birth family were farmers in rural Saskatchewan. Mm-hmm. I did not meet my birth father because he died in 1982. I was not allowed in those days. The rules said you could not go to reveal the file. It was all sealed records. So I couldn't go look for them. They couldn't look for me. But the ironic part was I was very high profile. My music, my playing the drums, my playing the trombone, my being in theater, we did musicals. I was always out there in the public, but also on television with documentaries and telethons I was doing. So my birth family clearly knew what happened to me. This was a very small part of Saskatchewan. They were pretty much sure that was me that they saw without arms. But when I met them, the intention was not to meet my real family because I was curious. I had a great family. My intention was brought on by, again, my wife, who basically said, look, Alvin, at some point, you're going to have to face the reality that you need to meet your family. If for any other reason, to sit down in a room with them and tell them you're fine, that you're not mad, that you never blamed them. So that's what I did. It was easy to find them because we did kind of know a little bit. We were able to find out my birth name, my last name. I found out they lived in Melville, which was about 20 minutes from Yorkton in Saskatchewan. It was just one phone call. Darlene made the call. We arranged to come to see them one trip to Yorkton because my parents lived there. Went and met them, and it was awkward and it was uncomfortable. But what I found out was they simply were just overwhelmed. They didn't have resources. They had no power. They had no running water. They had 2 other small children. But more than anything, they were farmers. They didn't have time to just drop everything and take care of the kid with no arms. That's the irony of my story. By going to live with Jack and Hilda Law, Mom Hilda Law, she was a full-time caregiver. Dad was the mechanic, but I was the one that stayed with my mom all the time. So there was always a mom there, always someone there to keep me going, to keep me pushing. But more than anything, I said it earlier, that's what my mom did. I had to take out the garbage in my teeth, for God's sake. I mean, that was nice, huh? So I knew that my upbringing was going to be challenged by tasks. But more than anything, it was big deal that my birth family, well, let's just put it this way. We were able to put that dark period behind us and move on. My birth mother died in the summer of 2020.
Okay, so did you ever ask her why she gave you up? Was it because they were farm people and they couldn't really take care of you? Was that her explanation?
That was the simple explanation. And I think it was just she felt really awkward in having to admit. But I think the confusion that was really funny, at one point, she came to visit our home in Calgary. And she got quite emotional because we have a very nice home. And she looked around, it's almost like, look what you've got. And then she said, I should have kept you. So I was very blunt with her, and I said, her name was Sophie. I didn't call her mom. I said, Sophie, I know, but you didn't. You know, it sounds like a cruel answer, but you didn't. Honey, please don't live your life with any regret. You can't go backwards. But more than anything, Sophie, I make this look like a romantic story. But Chris, you know what? Let's be blunt. This was not easy. This was hard. This was a lot of work. This was hospitals and clinics and doctors and rehabilitation. This was kids making fun of me a little bit. This was a community that was still trying to figure out what I was. It was not easy growing up without arms, but I couldn't have had better people behind me than Jack and Hilda Law. And I think she understood that. I don't think it was a competition, but she also understood very clearly, Sophie, I know you gave birth to me, but I'm never going to call you mom. I'm sorry. Now, interestingly, since my birth mom died, I've kind of, I haven't seen anything of my birth sister. Her name's Elaine. She's not a bad person, just a little bitter. But my birth brother, Alvin, who's 3 years older than me, 4 years older than me, we're really good friends. We see him every time we go out to Saskatchewan to our cottage at a lake, at Crystal Lake. We keep in touch. We've got pictures of me with the grandchildren. So, you know, that connection is still there. But at the end of the day, the family that you have is the most valuable thing that we sometimes take for granted.
And you say you're not inspirational? I think you're very inspirational. This is amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Wow.
Thank you.
I can't wait for people to watch this episode. So I wonder if I need to touch on something else. Did we talk about you enough?
I'm fine, Chris. I want to make sure you've asked all the questions you're wanting to know.
There are some questions I want to ask, but I don't want my audience to be freaked out or kind of grossed out. But you probably know what I'm talking about. But no, I'm going to ask some right questions, and I want to make sure I don't like pinpoint that, oh, this guy has arms, he's interesting. I want to pinpoint this guy's interesting, period. So what is the best compliment you've ever gotten?
Oh, that's a really very good question. I think the very special compliment I get, it happens several times during a calendar year. And it usually comes from somebody who saw me speak in the 80s or 90s when they were kids. And they run into me as an adult. And they talk about the impact that it had on them at that age when they were growing up, usually in a small part of Canada or America, wherever, that they remember me, that they remember my story, that they remember me playing the drums with my feet, that they remember me showing how I eat a hamburger in my toes. You know, they remember these things. That
I'm going to try that one day. Freak people out.
I'll bring lots of paper towels. That would be the compliment. You know, I think the ironic part about being who I am, especially doing a show like this where I'm talking about myself, is I'm quite humble. That was my parents in them. They were also very humble. They would always get all these their own compliments, but look what you did to that kid. And, you know, it was nothing. Anybody would do it. Yeah. You know, that's typical of a lot of heroes, right? The hero gets an award and they go, I didn't do anything different than anybody else would have done. Wrong answer. Not everybody would do what my parents did who adopted me. Not everybody would be able to perhaps get over what I've had to overcome. But at the end of the day, we need to be more complimentary to each other, more nice to each other. So, you know, that's another part of it too. I'm just really happy that people come up to me at all and say, I remember you.
Oh yeah, I'm actually so happy. It started with that when I tagged you on a post on my Facebook, and you said, "Yeah, maybe I should go on your podcast." I'm like, "Yeah, great idea. That's what I was thinking too." So you literally, it's like I'm just so happy that I was able to have you on, and gives people an idea of that. Yeah, that's great that Chris, you asked those questions, because I would never ask somebody those questions, So it's kind of interesting. I really appreciate that. But we have to end because I got another interview to have at 6 o'clock. So, can you give my audience one word of advice for when they're feeling down and low and realizing that people who have their, what am I trying to say? Give the word of advice to people that they can take away with them.
None of us are meant to live our lives dwelling in a cave all by ourselves. COVID should have taught us that. If we're looking for something to inspire us, something to give us meaning, something to take us out of a mental health hit, go out and volunteer for a less than lucky organization. Go to a homeless shelter. Go work at a pet rescue center. Go to a senior's home. Go someplace where people want someone to come in and visit with them, play cards with them, show some compassion with them. Because at the end of the day, I believe what gives people the most amount of joy of living is to help somebody else see joy in theirs. That would be my piece of advice to leave you today.
That's excellent. Everyone, Alvin's Laws of Life, 5 Steps to Successfully Overcome Anything, on paperback as of January 1st, 2007. Is there another, and we will link that below, is there another book you're writing or anything that you want to let people know that you're doing now?
No, and I will be very, very candid about my answer, because I get this all the time. You wrote one book, why didn't you write another one? Well, because the first book really kind of covers off the most important part of my story, and that's up to age 18. If I wrote another book, it would be kind of more like a travel log of my life since 1978 to 2023. I am, however, working on a second book now that you ask, because everybody's been bugging me. And the working title of that book is simply going to be called Yes, I Can. Tales of More Incredible Life Lived by yours truly, Alvin Law. So there are so many stories yet to be told. And there will be lots of notification on my website. My website, by the way, is still working. However, it is under construction. We're working on a brand new website that should be coming out sometime in the new year. But everybody can just keep in their minds alvinlaw.com. And by the way, if you go to alvinlaw.com, we have a way to send me an email. It's just info@alvinlaw.com. And I'd be more than happy to answer any of those questions that you might have come up with in your head once this podcast ended because you never got to them, you or any of your listeners. So please don't hesitate to get a hold of me there. And I want to thank you for doing this, Chris. I mean this. I really believe we need to have balance on public media and social media to show both sides of all the stories, but we need more positive shows because we sure do have enough negative ones. Thank you, Chris.
You're very welcome. And before we end the stream, I'm thinking that when you said, yeah, and I'm now working on, thinking, oh, tell me he's working on a TV show about a detective with no arms. Because there's actually, you ever heard of J.J. Arms? He's an actual, I think he's a police detective or a spy. And he does everything without arms, but he has these kind of like hooks that open, sort of. And he actually existed, and he did everything mostly with these hooks. Very well known. They made a adventure figure out of him and everything. But
I've never heard of that, but I can tell you one thing. I definitely didn't always want to be a cop.
I can imagine. Well, I feel blessed that you were on our podcast, and I look forward to maybe having you on again. How about that?
Sure. Anytime, Chris. And by the way, to all of your listeners again, keep in touch with Chris. He's good people. And we'll talk to you again, Chris. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm going to do this. I never do this. It's kind of like childish thing to do. I don't do this. You can't do this with your foot. Nah.
No, but what I do is I do my own namaste. Like namaste.
Oh, that's cool. I love it. Thanks, Alvin. Really appreciate that. Okay, everyone, we're going to end the stream. And Alvin Law and Chris Robert out. It's been a pleasure meeting you. It's been a pleasure meeting you. Awesome.
Thanks, brother. Nice meeting you too.
Take care of myself. Take care, brother. Yes, you're definitely my brother now. See you.